In the brutal winter of 1887, in the Montana Territory, silence was the loudest sound in the world. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of 30 children, too weak from hunger to cry. The history books mention the great die-up of cattle that year, but they rarely mention the people who were left behind to freeze. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the true documented account of Maris Vance, a corrupt banker named Silas Thorne, and a man known only as the Drifter, who rode into hell to bring heaven to a house of orphans. But the wagon he brought didn't just carry food, it carried a secret that would shatter the town of Bannock forever. The wind didn't just blow through Bannock, Montana, it hunted. On the morning of November 23, 1887, the temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. Inside the St. Jude's Home for Foundlings, the frost had crept up the inside of the window panes, forming jagged, icy claws that seemed desperate to get at the children huddled under threadbare wool blankets in the main hall. Matron Maris Vance stood in the center of the kitchen, her breath visible in the frigid air. She was a woman of 40, though the frontier had carved lines into her face that made her look 60. She wore a heavy grey shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the prep table. On the table sat the inventory: 3 withered potatoes, a half jar of lard, and a canister of coffee grounds that had been reused twice. That was it. That was Thanksgiving. Matron. Maris turned. It was Toby, a 7-year-old boy with eyes too big for his gaunt face. He was clutching a wooden soldier with a missing leg. "Is Mr. Thorne coming with the flour today?" Maris forced a smile, though it felt like cracking dried clay. "He's a busy man, Toby, but the Lord provides. Go back to the fire. Keep Sarah warm." As Toby shuffled away, the sound of carriage wheels crunching over hard-packed snow echoed from the yard. Maris's heart hammered against her ribs, a mix of dread and desperate hope. She smoothed her apron and walked to the heavy oak door. Stepping out onto the porch, the wind hit her like a physical blow. A black carriage, polished to an arrogant shine, sat in the yard. The driver, a hunched man named Cletus, didn't look at her. The door opened, and Silas Thorne stepped out. Thorne was a man who looked like he had never missed a meal in his life. His coat was lined with beaver fur, and his gold pocket watch chain glinted in the weak winter sun. He owned the Bannock Mercantile, the first bank, and effectively the sheriff. "Mr. Thorne," Maris said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We weren't expecting you until the delivery." Thorne didn't smile. He walked up the steps, his boots thudding heavily. He stopped 2 steps below her, yet somehow he still looked down on her. "There is no delivery, Mrs. Vance." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I don't understand. The town council approved the stipend. The credit line is overextended," Thorne cut in, his voice smooth and oily. "I reviewed the ledger this morning. St. Jude's is in arrears by $42.50. Until that is cleared, not a sack of flour leaves my warehouse." $40. Maris's voice rose, cracking with panic. "Silas, there are 32 children in here. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving. They haven't had meat in a month. They are eating watered-down gruel." "Then perhaps they should learn to work for their keep," Thorne sneered, dusting an invisible speck of snow from his sleeve. "But I am not a heartless man. I have a proposition." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. The paper crinkled in the cold. "Sign the deed to the property over to the bank. I know the coal vein runs under the East Ridge. You sign, I'll give you $100 and a wagon of food. You can relocate the brats to the mission in Helena." Maris stared at him, horror dawning. Helena was a 3-day ride through a blizzard. Half the children would die on the road. He wasn't asking for the land. He was signing their death warrants. "This is the only home they know," Maris whispered. "You'd kill them for coal?" "I'm a businessman, Maris. The railroad is coming. This land is valuable. The orphans are overhead." Thorne stepped closer, his eyes cold and dead. "You have until sunset. Sign the deed or starve. Those are your choices." He turned on his heel, climbed back into his carriage, and tapped the roof. As the carriage rolled away, Maris stood frozen on the porch. She looked out toward the tree line, toward the looming, jagged peaks of the Tobacco Root Mountains. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. A cold, hard rage settled in her gut. But rage wasn't food. She didn't notice the solitary figure watching her from the ridgeline, 300 yards away, through the scope of a Winchester 1873 rifle. The man lowered the rifle. He didn't shoot. He never shot unless he had to. Not anymore. He sat astride a roan mare that was as scarred and tough as he was. He wore a duster coat that had once been tan but was now stained with mud, grease, and old blood. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, hiding a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. A souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene. The locals whispered about him in the saloons, but no one knew his real name. They called him the Drifter, or sometimes, when the whiskey made them brave, Deadeye. His name was Jedediah Red Sterling, and 10 years ago he had been the most wanted bank robber in the Kansas Territory. Red spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. He adjusted the saddlebag where a heavy iron lockbox sat. It contained his life's savings, ill-gotten gains he had been saving to buy passage to Mexico. He was tired of running. He was tired of looking over his shoulder for the Pinkertons. He had only stopped in Bannock to rest the horse. He had no business here. But for the last 2 days, he had found himself camped on this ridge, watching the orphanage. Specifically, watching a small boy with a limp, Toby. Red reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver locket. He clicked it open. Inside was a tintype photograph of a woman with laughing eyes and a baby on her lap. "Take care of him, Jed. If the law catches up to you, promise me you won't let him grow up in a cell." Mary's dying words echoed in his head, as loud as the wind. When Mary died of the fever in 82, Red had panicked. The law was closing in. He had left the boy on the steps of a church in Denver and rode away. He told himself it was for the boy's safety. He told himself he was a monster who would only get the kid killed. He had spent 5 years hating himself for it. He had tracked the movement of the orphans from Denver to Bannock, always staying a ghost, always watching from the shadows. He told himself he just wanted to see if the boy was okay. Just one look. Through the scope, he had seen the interaction on the porch. He didn't need to hear the words to know what happened. He knew men like Silas Thorne. He had robbed men like Silas Thorne. They were wolves in silk suits. Red watched Maris Vance slump against the doorframe, her shoulders shaking. He looked at the smoke, barely trickling from the chimney. They were out of fuel. They were out of food. He looked down at his saddlebag. There was enough gold in there to buy a ranch in Mexico. Peace. Tequila. Sun. He looked back at the orphanage. He saw Toby limp out to the porch and tug on the woman's skirt. Red cursed. It was a vile, creative curse that startled his horse. "Easy, girl," he muttered, patting the mare's neck. He knew he shouldn't get involved. The sheriff in town, a man named Caleb Pike, was sharp. If Red walked into town, Pike might recognize the description on the wanted posters. A scar like Red's wasn't easy to forget. But Red also knew that it was Thanksgiving tomorrow, and he remembered the gnawing pain of an empty belly from his own childhood. He spurred the horse, but not toward the orphanage. He turned the mare toward the town of Bannock. "1 wagon," Red muttered to the wind. "I get 'em 1 wagon of food, drop it off, and I'm gone. Mexico by Christmas." He rode down the switchbacks, the snow crunching under hooves. He rode with the confidence of a man walking to his own hanging. When he arrived in Bannock, the town was bustling with last-minute holiday preparations. The smell of roasting turkey wafted from the hotel, mocking him. He pulled his hat low and tied his horse outside the general store. Thorne's store. He walked in, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. The warmth hit him, smelling of spices, sawdust, and cured leather. Silas Thorne was behind the counter, berating a young clerk. He looked up as Red approached. Thorne's eyes narrowed, scanning Red's worn duster and the gun belt that hung low on his hips. Thorne despised trash, and this man looked like high-grade trash. "We don't give handouts to drifters," Thorne said, not bothering to stop counting a stack of bills. Red leaned against the counter. He moved with a lazy, coiled grace. "Not asking for one. I want to buy supplies." Thorne paused. "You have money?" Red reached into his pocket and slapped a profound, heavy gold eagle coin onto the counter. The sound was distinct, the heavy thud of real wealth. Thorne's eyebrows shot up. He picked up the coin, biting it suspiciously, then nodded. "Gold is good here. What do you need?" "I need a wagon," Red said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "And I need it filled. 50 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of potatoes, 10 smoked hams, 5 sacks of beans, dried apples, sugar, lard, and blankets, 30 wool blankets." Thorne stopped writing. He looked up, a strange glint in his eyes. He connected the dots instantly, the quantity, the timing. "That's a lot of supplies for one man," Thorne said slowly. "I got a big appetite," Red replied flatly. Thorne smirked. "I'm afraid I can't help you." "I see the goods on the shelf," Red said, his hand drifting inches from his holster. "Those are reserved," Thorne lied, "for loyal customers. And even if they weren't, I don't sell to strangers who intend to aid failing enterprises I'm in the process of acquiring." Thorne knew. He knew Red intended to take this to the orphanage. "You're saying you won't sell food?" Red asked, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm saying," Thorne leaned over the counter, his face twisting into a sneer, "that this is my town, and I decide who eats. Now take your dirty gold and get out before I call Sheriff Pike." Red stared at him. For a second, the violence in Red's blood surged. It would be so easy. A flick of the wrist, a thunderclap, and Thorne would be a memory. But that wouldn't feed the kids. That would just bring a posse. Red snatched the gold coin back from the counter. "You're making a mistake, friend." "I'm not your friend," Thorne spat. Red turned and walked out. The cold air hit him again, but he didn't feel it. He was burning up. He walked to his horse, untied the reins, and looked around the town. He saw the bank across the street. He saw the sheriff's office 2 doors down. He couldn't buy the food. Thorne had blocked him. Red mounted his horse and trotted toward the alleyway behind the livery stables. He stopped in the shadows and pulled a bandana from his pocket. If he couldn't buy it, and he couldn't beg for it, there was only one way left. The old way. He wasn't going to rob the bank. That was too noisy. He looked at the back of Thorne's warehouse, where the loading dock was piled high with crates covered in canvas. Red checked his Colt Peacemaker. 6 rounds. "Mexico's gonna have to wait," he whispered. Night fell over Bannock like a heavy wool blanket, smothering the light and bringing a silence that was only broken by the howling wind. The temperature had dropped further, turning the mud in the streets to stone. Red Sterling stood in the alleyway behind Thorne's warehouse, blowing warm air into his cupped hands. His fingers felt stiff, a dangerous condition for a man whose life, often depended on the speed of his draw. He watched the back entrance. A single lantern swung above the loading bay, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn timber. He wasn't going in with guns blazing. That was a young man's game, a dead man's game. He watched the guard, a burly man known as Whiskey Pete, making his rounds. Pete was shivering, stamping his feet and taking frequent pulls from a flask. Red waited. Patience was a weapon he had honed over a decade of dodging marshals. At 9 p.m., the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof of the warehouse. Pete cursed and ducked inside a small shack near the gate to warm up by a pot-belly stove. That was the window. Red moved. He was surprisingly quiet for a big man, his boots wrapped in burlap sacks he'd scavenged to muffle his steps and hide his distinctive tread. He slipped through a gap in the fence he'd spotted earlier and ghosted across the yard. He reached the heavy sliding door of the warehouse. It was locked with a heavy iron padlock. Red pulled a set of tension tools from his pocket, slender pieces of steel he kept for emergencies. His hands were shaking from the cold, making the delicate work agonizing. Click. The lock sprang open. Red glanced at the guard shack. No movement. He slid the door open just enough to squeeze through, wincing as the rusted rollers let out a low groan that sounded like a dying animal. He paused, holding his breath. The wind masked the sound. Inside, the warehouse smelled of grain, dry rot, and money. Stacks of crates reached the ceiling. It was a dragon's hoard of supplies, while the town outside scraped by. Red didn't waste time. He found a sturdy buckboard wagon near the rear, already hitched to 2 sleeping draft horses. Thorne kept them ready for early morning deliveries to the mines. "Sorry, boys," Red whispered to the horses, stroking their velvet noses to keep them calm. "You got a night shift." He began to load. He moved with a frantic, silent intensity. He grabbed 50-pound sacks of flour, tossing them into the wagon bed as if they were pillows. He found the smoked hams hanging from rafters and cut them down, piling them high. He raided the shelves for canned peaches, coffee, sugar, and the precious lard Maris had lacked. He was sweating now, despite the freezing air. His old shoulder wound throbbed with every lift. He was reaching for a stack of wool blankets when the warehouse door creaked open further. Light spilled in, a lantern held high. "Who's in here?" It wasn't Pete. It was Cletus, Thorne's driver. He had come to check the horses. Red froze in the shadows behind a stack of crates. Cletus stepped in, his other hand resting on the handle of a skinning knife at his belt. "I heard you," Cletus growled, stepping closer to the wagon. "Come out, rat." Red calculated the distance. 10 feet. If he drew his gun, the shot would wake the town. If he let Cletus raise the alarm, the sheriff would be here in 2 minutes. Cletus saw the loaded wagon. His eyes went wide. He turned to shout. Red launched himself from the shadows. He tackled Cletus, slamming him into a stack of grain sacks. The lantern flew from Cletus's hand, shattering on the floor. Thankfully, the flame sputtered out in the dirt instead of catching the dry wood. Cletus was strong, fueled by panic. He drove a knee into Red's gut and swung a wild haymaker that caught Red on the cheekbone. Stars exploded in Red's vision. "Thief!" Cletus hissed, grappling for his knife. Red grunted, blocking the knife hand. He headbutted Cletus, a brutal, sharp crack of bone on bone. Cletus staggered back, dazed. Red followed up with a precise right hook to the jaw. Cletus crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Red stood over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. He wiped it away with his sleeve. He quickly bound Cletus's hands and feet with rope and gagged him with a grain sack. "You'll be warm enough till morning," Red muttered. He checked the time. He had taken too long. He climbed onto the wagon seat and snapped the reins. "Higher!" The draft horses, surprised and strong, lunged forward. Red didn't bother with stealth anymore. He drove the wagon right through the open warehouse doors, shattering the wooden gate of the yard as he barreled into the street. "Hey!" Pete yelled from the guard shack, stumbling out with his shotgun. Boom! Buckshot tore through the air, splintering the side of the wagon, missing Red by inches. Red didn't return fire. He whipped the horses, turning the heavy wagon toward the north road, toward the mountains. He needed speed. He needed the storm. As he galloped out of town, he looked back. Lights were flicking on in windows. The town was waking up. He had maybe 20 minutes before a posse was mounted. But the snow was falling harder now, a white curtain that would cover his tracks. The ride to the orphanage was a blur of adrenaline and freezing wind. The wagon slipped and skidded on the icy switchbacks, the heavy load threatening to tip them into the ravine at every turn. Red drove with the skill of a man born in the saddle, coaxing the terrified horses up the ridge. When the silhouette of St. Jude's appeared against the grey pre-dawn sky, Red felt a strange tightening in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He pulled the wagon into the yard, right up to the front porch where Maris had stood yesterday. The house was dark, silent as a tomb. He jumped down, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He worked quickly, unloading the sacks and crates onto the porch. He stacked them high, a barricade of sustenance against the cold. He didn't want to be seen. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted to be gone before the sun crested the peaks. But as he placed the final ham on top of a barrel of flour, the front door creaked open. Red spun around, hand hovering near his gun. It was Toby. The boy was wearing a nightshirt that was little more than a rag, shivering violently. He held a candle in shaking hands. The boy and the outlaw stared at each other. Toby looked at the mountain of food. He looked at the scarred man with the bleeding face. His eyes went wide, reflecting the candlelight. Are you Santa Claus?" Toby whispered, his teeth chattering. Red looked at his muddy duster, his bloodied knuckles, and the terrifying iron on his hip. He almost laughed. "No, kid. Just a delivery man." Toby took a step forward. "You're bleeding." "I cut myself shaving," Red rasped. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the one thing he shouldn't give away, the silver locket. He looked at it one last time, Mary's face. Then he looked at the boy, her boy. Red knelt, bringing himself to eye level with his son. He pressed the locket into Toby's small, cold hand. "You keep this," Red said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't suppress. "It's got magic in it. Keeps you brave." "What's your name?" Toby asked. "Doesn't matter," Red said, standing up abruptly. "Go inside. Get the matron. Tell her, Happy Thanksgiving." Red vaulted back onto the wagon seat. He needed to dump the wagon miles away to throw off the trail. He snapped the reins, and the draft horses thundered away, vanishing into the swirling snow. Toby stood on the porch, clutching the warm silver locket, surrounded by enough food to feed a king. "Matron!" he screamed, his voice piercing the silence. "Matron, come look!" Inside, Maris Vance woke with a start. She thought she was dreaming. She grabbed her shawl and ran to the door, expecting a fire or a wolf. When she opened the door, she stopped dead. The porch was groaning under the weight. Sacks of flour, crates of potatoes, smoked hams that smelled of hickory and salvation. The children, awakened by Toby's shout, began to pour into the hallway. They pushed past Maris, gasping. "Is it real?" little Sarah asked, reaching out to touch a sack of beans. Maris fell to her knees. She picked up a potato. It was frozen solid, hard as a rock, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Tears, hot and fast, streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "It's real," she choked out. God has sent an angel." "He didn't look like an angel," Toby said matter-of-factly, examining the locket. "He looked like a cowboy, and he gave me these." Maris looked at the locket. It was old silver, engraved with initials. MS. She frowned. It looked expensive, too expensive for a delivery man. But there was no time for questions. There was only hunger. "Everyone," Maris commanded, her voice finding its old strength. "Get the wood. Break up the old fence if you have to. We are firing up the stove. Today, we feast." For the next 4 hours, the orphanage transformed. The gloom was replaced by the roar of the stove and the manic energy of starving children given hope. The smell of frying bacon and boiling potatoes filled the drafty halls, chasing away the smell of mildew. Maris cooked like a woman possessed. She made biscuits. She roasted the hams. She made a gravy so thick it could stand up a spoon. At noon they sat at the long wooden tables. There were no tablecloths, but there was food. Heaps of it. Maris stood at the head of the table to say grace. She looked at the faces, rosy from the heat of the kitchen, eyes shining. "Lord," she began, her voice trembling. "We thank you for this bounty. We thank you for the stranger who brought it. We ask that you keep him safe, wherever he is." "Amen," the children shouted. They ate. They ate until their bellies were tight as drums. For the first time in months, there was laughter in St. Jude's. But outside the storm was clearing, and with the clear sky came the law. The sound of galloping horses interrupted the dessert of stewed apples. Maris froze. She went to the window. Sheriff Caleb Pike was riding into the yard. Beside him, on a black stallion, sat Silas Thorne. And behind them were 4 deputies with rifles. Thorne's face was twisted in a mask of fury that made him look demonic. Maris turned to the children. "Stay here. Continue eating." She walked out onto the porch, wiping her flour-stained hands on her apron. She stood in front of the remaining stack of supplies, shielding them with her body. Sheriff Pike dismounted. He was a tall man with a drooping mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He walked up the steps, his spurs jingling. "Afternoon, Mrs. Vance," Pike said, tipping his hat. "Smells good." "Sheriff," Maris nodded. "Mr. Thorne, to what do we owe the pleasure? Came to evict us on a holiday?" Thorne practically leaped from his horse. He pointed a gloved finger at the flour sacks. "That's mine. That is my flour. My hams. Stolen from my warehouse last night." Maris's heart stopped. Stolen. She looked at the branding on the flour sack. Thorne Mercantile. I didn't know," Maris stammered. "It was left here. A donation." "A donation?" Thorne screamed. "By whom? A ghost? That drift trash Sterling, that's who. He assaulted my driver and stole my property." Thorne pushed past Pike and grabbed a sack of potatoes. "I'm taking this back, all of it, and I'm arresting you for receiving stolen goods, Maris Vance." "You will do no such thing," Maris shouted, stepping in front of him. "The children are eating. You can't take the food out of their mouths." "Watch me," Thorne snarled. "Hold on, Silas," Sheriff Pike said, his voice calm but hard as iron. Pike walked over to the stack of goods. He looked at the tracks in the snow. He looked at the half-eaten ham on the table inside through the window. "The food's been cooked, Silas," Pike said. "You can't resell a roasted ham." "I want them arrested," Thorne's spittle flew. "She conspired with him. That drifter came here yesterday. I saw them talking." Pike turned to Maris. "Did you see the man who brought this, Maris?" "No," she lied. "It was here when we woke up." "She's lying," Thorne yelled. "Search the brats! Search the house!" Pike sighed. "Silas, calm down." But then Pike's eyes caught something. He looked at Toby, who had wandered out onto the porch, clutching the silver locket. Pike walked over to the boy. He knelt down. "That's a pretty locket, son," Pike said softly. "Where'd you get it?" Toby looked at Maris, then at the sheriff. "The cowboy gave it to me. The one who brought the food." Thorne triumphed. "Aha! Proof!" Pike held out his hand. "Can I see it, son?" Toby reluctantly handed it over. Pike clicked it open. He looked at the picture of the woman. Pike's face went pale. He recognized the woman. He had seen her picture on a wanted poster from Kansas 5 years ago. Mary Sterling, wife of the notorious bank robber, Jedediah Sterling. Pike snapped the locket shut. He looked at Toby, really looked at him. The jawline, the eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," Pike whispered. He stood up and turned to Thorne. "We have a problem, Silas. The only problem is that my inventory is in the bellies of these paupers." Thorne raged. "No," Pike said, his hand resting on his gun. "The problem is that the man who stole this, he isn't just a drifter, and he's still in these mountains." Pike looked at the snowy peaks. He knew Red Sterling's reputation. If Sterling was here and he was helping the orphanage, this wasn't just a robbery. It was a war, and Sheriff Pike had to decide which side he was on. Sheriff Caleb Pike sat in his office, the potbelly stove rattling as it fought a losing battle against the Montana freeze. On his desk sat a bottle of whiskey and the assay report he had confiscated from Silas Thorne's safe 2 months ago, the leverage he had been too cowardly to use until now. He poured a drink. His hand didn't shake, but his conscience did. Pike had been a lawman for 20 years. He had chased cattle rustlers and broken up saloon brawls, but he had never been a hero. He was a man who kept the peace by knowing which hands to shake and which eyes to look away from. For years he had looked away from Silas Thorne. Thorne owned the bank. He owned the land. And, as the assay report proved, he knew that the ridge St. Jude sat upon was sitting on top of a bituminous coal vein worth $500,000. "Sheriff!" The door swung open. Thorne walked in, bringing a gust of snow and the smell of expensive cologne mixed with fury. He was followed by 3 men Pike didn't recognize, hard men with low-slung holsters and eyes like sharks. "Who are these men, Silas?" Pike asked, not standing up. "Insurance," Thorne spat, dusting snow from his coat. "Since you seem incapable of doing your job, I wired the Pinkerton office in Butte 3 days ago. These gentlemen arrived on the afternoon stage." Pike looked at the hired guns. "Pinkertons? In Bannock? You're turning my town into a war zone over a few sacks of flour?" "It's not about the flour, you old fool." Thorne slammed his fist on the desk. "It's about order. It's about property rights. That man, Sterling, he humiliated me. And that woman, Maris, is harboring a fugitive. I want them out. Tonight." Pike leaned back, his chair creaking. "It's Thanksgiving, Silas, and it's 10 below zero. You can't evict 30 orphans into the snow. The law requires 30 days' notice." "The law," Thorne sneered, leaning in close, "is what I pay for. And if you won't enforce it, Mr. Kincaid here will." The lead mercenary, Kincaid, stepped forward. He had a scar running through his eyebrow and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We handle property disputes, Sheriff. Messy ones." Pike stood up slowly. "If you go up there and hurt those kids, I'll hang you myself." Thorne laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. "You won't do anything, Caleb. You know why? Because you owe the bank on your ranch. You miss one payment, and your wife is out in the snow with those orphans. Now, are you with us, or are you retiring early?" Pike looked at the badge on his chest. It felt heavy. He looked at the assay report. "I'm coming with you," Pike said quietly, "to make sure no one gets killed." "Good," Thorne said, checking his pocket watch. "We ride in an hour. I want the orphanage empty and burned to the ground by midnight. We'll claim it was an accident, a stove fire. Tragic." Pike felt the bile rise in his throat. Burned! Silas, that's murder! It's urban renewal, Thorne said, turning to leave. The railroad needs a depot. St. Jude's is in the way. As the door closed, Pike grabbed his Winchester. He didn't load it with the standard rounds. He reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a box of armor-piercing rounds he had saved since the Indian Wars. He wasn't going to let Thorne burn those kids. But he also knew he couldn't stop 4 men alone. He needed help, and the only help available was the very man he was supposed to arrest. High on the ridge, 3 miles from the orphanage, Red Sterling sat in a small cave, warming his hands over a smokeless fire. His horse, shivering near the entrance, whinnied softly. Red was cleaning his guns. He had seen the riders coming into town earlier, the slickers from Butte. He knew what Pinkertons looked like. He could smell them a mile away. He knew he should leave. He had done his good deed. He had fed the boy. The smart play was to ride south, cross the pass, and disappear into Idaho before the snow blocked the trails. But he couldn't get the image of Toby out of his head. The boy had Mary's chin. He had Mary's kindness, and he had Red's stubbornness. Red checked the cylinder of his peacemaker. He spun it. Click, click, click. He wasn't a hero. He was a bank robber, a killer. But for the first time in 10 years, he felt like a father. One more night, he whispered to the fire. I just watch 'em for one more night. Suddenly, the crack of a twig outside the cave made him freeze. In one fluid motion, he kicked snow over the fire and leveled his Winchester at the entrance. Don't shoot, Red, a voice called out from the dark. It's the law. Red didn't lower the rifle. You're a long way from your office, Sheriff Pike. Pike stepped into the cave entrance, his hands raised, holding a lantern. I came alone. That was stupid, Red growled. I could drop you before you cleared leather. I know, Pike said, sitting down on a rock, exhaling a plume of white breath. But we got a problem. Silas Thorne isn't coming for the flour. He's coming for the land. He's got 3 Pinkertons with him. They're going up to St. Jude's tonight to burn it down. Red's finger tightened on the trigger. Burn it? With the kids inside? He plans to make it look like an accident, Pike explained. He wants the coal under the ridge. I can't stop 4 men, Red. Not alone. I'm asking for your help. Red stared at the lawman. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. You want the most wanted man in the territory to help you uphold the law. I want the father of that boy to help me save his life, Pike said softly. Silence stretched between them, heavy and cold. Red lowered the rifle. You knew. I saw the locket, Pike said. Mary Sterling. I remember the wanted posters. She was a good woman, from what I read. She didn't deserve to die on the run. Red looked away, the pain fresh as a wound. She deserved better than me. Maybe, Pike said, but that boy deserves a father right now, or at least a guardian angel. Red stood up, holstering his gun. He grabbed his hat and jammed it onto his head. The lethargy was gone. In its place was a cold, calculated rage, the kind of rage that had made him a legend in Kansas. How many men? Red asked. Thorne, 3 Pinkertons, and Cletus the driver. 5 guns. And you? 6, Pike said, racking the slide of his rifle. Red shook his head. No. You stay back. You're the law. If you shoot Thorne, you hang. If I shoot him, well, they can't hang me twice. Red, they're professionals. They'll cut you down. Red walked past Pike, mounting his horse. The moonlight caught the jagged scar on his face, making him look like a vengeful spirit. Let 'em try, Red said. Nobody touches my boy. The moon was full, casting a stark blue light over the St. Jude's orphanage. Inside, the children were asleep, their bellies full for the first time in months. Maris sat in the rocking chair by the stove, keeping vigil. She held a heavy cast-iron skillet in her lap, her only weapon. She heard the horses before she saw them, the thudding of hooves on packed snow, not the rhythmic trot of travelers, but the aggressive gallop of raiders. Maris blew out the lantern. "Toby!" she hissed into the dark room. "Wake everyone up, quietly. Get to the cellar." "Matron?" Toby rubbed his eyes. "Now!" she commanded. Outside, 5 riders halted in the yard. Silas Thorne sat atop his horse, a torch in his hand. The flames sputtered in the wind, illuminating his face. He looked manic. "Open up, Vance!" Thorne screamed. "By order of the bank, this property is foreclosed." Kincaid, the head Pinkerton, didn't wait for an answer. He raised his Winchester and fired a shot through the front window. Glass shattered. Inside, children screamed. "Get them out or roast them inside!" Thorne yelled, throwing the torch onto the porch. The dry wood, despite the cold, caught fire instantly. Fueled by the kerosene Cletus had splashed on the steps moments before. Maris herded the children toward the kitchen trapdoor. "Go! Don't stop!" The front door kicked open. Kincaid stepped in, his boots crunching on glass. He saw Maris standing in the hallway, blocking the path to the kitchen. "Move, lady," Kincaid growled. "Over my dead body," Maris said, raising the skillet. Kincaid laughed and raised the butt of his rifle to strike her. Crack. A sound like a whip crack tore through the night, but it wasn't from inside the house. Kincaid's hat flew off his head, pinned to the wall behind him by a bullet. He froze, eyes wide. "I wouldn't do that," a voice called out from the darkness of the tree line. Thorne spun his horse around. "Who's there?" From the shadows of the pine trees, a single rider emerged. He walked his horse slowly into the moonlight. He held a Winchester in one hand, resting casually on his thigh. "Evening, Silas," Red Sterling said. "Chilly night for a bonfire." "Kill him!" Thorne shrieked. "It's the drifter. Kill him!" The 3 Pinkertons turned their guns toward Red. Red didn't flinch. He spurred his horse, not away from them, but toward them. He moved with a speed that defied logic. He dropped off the side of his saddle, using the horse as a shield as the Pinkertons opened fire. Bullets whizzed through the air. Red's horse screamed, taking a round to the flank but kept charging. Red rolled off into a snowbank behind the water trough. He popped up, levering his rifle. Bang! Bang! 2 shots. 2 Pinkertons fell from their saddles, clutching their shoulders. Red didn't shoot to kill. Not yet. He shot to disarm. Kincaid, realizing he was outmatched, dove behind Thorne's carriage. "He's a pro!" Kincaid yelled. "Flank him!" Inside the burning house, Maris used the distraction. She grabbed a heavy vase and smashed it over the head of the 3rd Pinkerton, who was trying to enter the hallway. He went down in a heap. "Get to the barn," Maris shouted to the older boys. "Get the buckets, the snow." Outside, the gunfight had turned into a stalemate. Red was pinned down behind the trough. Kincaid was behind the carriage. Thorne was cowering behind a tree. "You're a dead man, Sterling," Thorne yelled. "You can't hold us all off." "I don't have to," Red shouted back. "I just have to wait for you to freeze or make a mistake." Suddenly, Cletus, who had been hiding near the woodpile, saw an opening. He saw Toby. The boy had snuck out the back door, trying to reach the well to help with the fire. Cletus lunged, grabbing the boy by his nightshirt. "I got one!" Cletus yelled, dragging Toby into the open yard. "Drop the gun, Drifter, or the kid bleeds!" Red froze. He stood up slowly from behind the trough, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Let him go," Red said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "Drop it." Cletus pressed a knife to Toby's throat. Toby was crying, his eyes locked on Red. Red slowly placed his rifle on the ground. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall into the snow. He raised his hands. "There," Red said. "I'm unarmed. Let the boy go." Thorn stepped out from behind the tree, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, well. The wolf has a soft spot." Thorn walked up to Red, pulling a small Derringer pistol from his coat pocket. He aimed it at Red's chest. "You ruined my business," Thorn spat. "You humiliated me. And you're about to murder a man in front of 30 witnesses," Red said, eyes darting to Cletus. "Think about it, Silas. You pull that trigger, there's no going back." "I own the witnesses," Thorn sneered. He cocked the hammer. "No!" Toby screamed. He bit Cletus's hand, hard. Cletus howled and dropped the knife. Toby scrambled away. Thorn flinched at the scream. His finger twitched on the trigger. Bang! The shot rang out. Red stumbled back, clutching his chest. He fell into the snow, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his duster. "No!" Maris screamed from the porch. Thorn stared at the smoking gun in his hand, looking almost surprised. Then he smiled. "Done." He turned to Kincaid. "Finish the boy. No witnesses." Kincaid raised his rifle toward Toby, who was kneeling beside Red's body. But before Kincaid could fire, a booming voice echoed from the darkness. "Drop it!" Sheriff Pike stepped into the light, his shotgun leveled. Behind him were 20 men, miners, shopkeepers, fathers. The town had woken up. They had seen the fire, and they had seen everything. "It's over, Silas," Pike said, his voice shaking with rage. Thorn looked at the mob. He looked at Pike. He realized, for the first time in his life, his money couldn't buy his way out of this. He was a bank robber," Thorn stammered, pointing at Red's motionless body. "I was defending the town." "You shot an unarmed man," Pike said, walking forward and ripping the Derringer from Thorn's hand. "And you tried to burn children. Cuff him." 2 miners grabbed Thorn, throwing him roughly to the ground. Kincaid and Cletus threw their hands up, surrendering instantly. Pike didn't look at them. He ran to Red. Maris was already there, pressing a towel to Red's chest. Toby was holding Red's hand, tears streaming down his face. "Is he?" Pike asked, kneeling down. Red's eyes fluttered open. He coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Toby. Did I get him?" Red rasped. "You got him," Toby sobbed. "You saved us." Red smiled, a weak, crooked thing. He looked at Pike. Don't let him put me in a cage, Caleb." "I won't," Pike promised, gripping Red's shoulder. "I won't." Red's eyes drifted to the locket hanging around Toby's neck. He reached out a trembling hand and touched it. "Mary," he whispered. Then his hand fell back into the snow. The drifter was still. The snow continued to fall, covering the blood, covering the sins of the town, and covering the man who had given everything for a wagon full of love. The funeral for Jedediah. Red Sterling was the largest gathering Bannock had ever seen. Even the miners came down from the hills, standing hat in hand in the freezing sleet. They buried him in the churchyard, right next to the old oak tree that overlooked the valley. The grave marker was simple wood, carved by the older boys of the orphanage. "Here lies a friend." Nov, 1887. Silas Thorn was stripped of his assets and sent to the territorial prison in Yuma. Without his stranglehold on the town, the bank was audited. The deed to the orphanage was found in his safe, not yet countersigned. St. Jude's was safe. Life moved on. The great die-up winter eventually thawed into a lush, green spring. The coal vein under the ridge was leased to a mining company from Denver, not for a lump sum, but for a royalty deal negotiated by Sheriff Pike. St. Jude's didn't just survive, it flourished. They built a new wing, a schoolhouse, and a proper barn. But the story doesn't end in the graveyard. 6 months later, on a warm evening in May, Sheriff Pike rode out to the orphanage. He sat on the porch with Maris Vance, watching Toby teach the younger children how to whittle. "I got a letter today," Pike said, pulling a crumpled envelope from his vest. It had a Mexican postmark. Maris's hands stilled over her knitting. She looked at Pike, her eyes wide. "Is it from him?" she whispered. Pike nodded. He took a sip of his coffee. "He says the chest wound still aches when it rains, but the Mexican sun helps. He says he bought a small cattle ranch in Chihuahua. He calls it the second chance." Toby, who had been listening, ran over. "Sheriff? Is it Mr. Red?" Pike smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled his eyes. "You keep a secret, Toby." Toby nodded vigorously, clutching the silver locket that never left his neck. "That night in the snow," Pike said quietly, "when I checked his pulse, it was faint, threadbare. But it was there. I knew if the Pinkertons or the circuit judge found out he was alive, they'd hang him for his past crimes. Bannock needed a martyr, but a boy needed a father." Maris wiped a tear from her eye. "So you buried a box of rocks?" "Stones weigh about the same as a man," Pike winked. "Dr. Evans patched him up in my cellar. Took him 3 weeks to be able to sit a horse. I sent him south on the midnight stage." Pike handed the letter to Maris. Inside was a bank draft for $500. A fortune. "He says this is the first installment," Pike read. "He says to tell the boy he's saving a horse for him, a roan mare. Says she's stubborn, just like her owner." Toby looked at the distant mountains, his hand tight around the locket. He didn't smile. He looked determined. "I'm going there," Toby said. "When I'm big, I'm going to Mexico." "I reckon you will, son," Pike said. The twist of St. Jude's wasn't the food or the fight. The twist was that the outlaw who died a hero lived to become a father. Toby Vance eventually did ride south when he turned 18. He found the ranch. He found the old man with the scar, and decades later, when Toby returned to Montana to become the first governor of the state, he founded the sterling foundation for at-risk youth. The grave in Bannock is still there. It's empty, of course. But the flowers fresh on the grass every Thanksgiving? Those are very, very real. Today, if you visit the ghost town of Bannock, Montana, you can still see the foundation of the St. Jude's home. The history books will tell you it was funded by coal money. They will tell you Sheriff Caleb Pike was a local hero who cleaned up the town. But they won't tell you about the midnight wagon. They won't tell you about the empty grave on the hill. We tell this story not because it's a legend, but because it's a testament to the fact that even the broken men, the outlaws, and the drifters are capable of profound acts of love. Red Sterling stole gold, yes, but in the end, he stole death from the jaws of a brutal winter and gave 30 children a future. Sometimes the bad guys are just good guys who haven't found their cause yet. What do you think? Was Sheriff Pike right to fake Red's death and let a wanted bank robber go free? Or is the law, no matter the good deed? I want to hear your verdict in the comments below, hero or criminal. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these forgotten pieces of history. And if you want more true tales of the Wild West, from the lawless Badlands to the mysterious heroes of the frontier, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have a story about a ghostly train coming up next week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and have a blessed Thanksgiving. We'll see you on the trail.